Most of what I do is online stuff. I started off tutoring the LSAT. I actually never thought I'd be doing that because back when I started studying for the LSAT in 2005, I thought I was smart, thought I was going to go to a top 14, and then I got a 152 on my practice test. And so I thought, that's done. But I got obsessed with it. At that point, there were 40-something released exams. And so I just thought, well, I'll do all of those and learn what I need to know. And of course, it's not a good idea to just go through exam after exam. You have to analyze things. And that's what I came to learn over time, is that I had to analyze the patterns in my mistakes, everything I got wrong, everything I had difficulty with, and very gradually over the course of an entire year, I brought my score up to a 175. And at that point, friends and friends of friends started asking me, how do I prep for this? What should I do? And so I'd sit down and I'd do a study session with them. I'd go over a few problems and it helped them. And so I thought, well, I could charge for this. So I'd been tutoring other things in the past, like the SATs, the ACT. In New York State, we have the Regents exams. And so I would tutor those. And I thought, I'll just tutor the LSAT also. And because it's so much more niche than anything else, that became my focus. And I also loved it. It's much more complex than the GMAT or the GRE. I don't know if you've ever looked at either of those, but they're a lot easier. Even if you don't like math, the math is like what you learned in high school. The LSAT is something else altogether. And so I went pretty deep down the rabbit hole, and I loved it. And once I graduated college, I wanted to do this full time. So I thought, I'll just keep tutoring. I should make a website to market myself. And so I did that. It's the LSAT blog. It's still the same website. And I've been running that for 10 years now. And so I started posting articles first once a week, and then 3 times a week, and then every day. And then I had 1,000 articles, and no one's going to read that many. So I slowed down on that. But with the rise of the internet and video and podcast, that's been my new focus. And so my primary focus is honestly just putting out free stuff on every aspect of prep, from the logic games, logical reasoning, reading comp, test day prep, test day anxiety, scheduling. Actually, one of the most popular things I have on my site are the day-by-day LSAT study plans. I have free week-by-week ones, but I've got to pay the bills, so I charge for the day-by-day ones. They're $20 to $25 depending on which one you get, and they cover periods of study from as short as 1 month all the way up to 7 months. And I recommend a minimum of 3 to 5 months, but if you've got less time than that, I've got you covered with the 1 and 2 month schedules. Those are the most popular thing I offer. One other cool thing about my site is the LSAT diaries. I've had many students writing over the years, just documenting their journeys. And so you can read their stories. You can see the stories of someone who went from a 141 to a 168, or a 160 to a 170. Wherever your starting point is, you can follow the journey of someone who progressed along the way and see their ultimate outcome. And so yeah, this is what I do. I do have online courses. I charge for them. The lowest cost one is $279. And so if you're looking for something more affordable, that could be a good option. Of course, there are many more benefits to the in-person class, but that's not always an option. So if you need the online, it is available to you. I do a small amount of one-on-one coaching. I work with a limited number of students, typically 3 to 5 for each LSAT administration. You can start with the self-study and then take it from there. You can start with a day-by-day plan for $20. If that's not enough, then you can consider adding on more resources. But I thought to myself, there's got to be something for everyone along the spectrum. So I've got the free stuff, the study schedules that are 20 to 25, then the course is a couple $100, and then the one-on-one, which is obviously much more than that. But I try to have something for everybody, and I have a lot of fun with this. On the YouTube and the podcast, I'm interviewing law school admissions people, other LSAT instructors, sharing my own tips. Most of the videos are pretty short, but I try to have some interviews that are 20 to 30 minutes. And so check them out and let me know what you think. If you send me an email with a screenshot of your subscription to either the YouTube or the podcast, I'll send you an LSAT checklist for free. If you subscribe to both, I'll send you 2 checklists covering different parts of the exam. So yeah, that's pretty much what I do. I love it. Been doing it now for 13 years and no plans to stop. It's somewhat easy to measure your progress because you can take a diagnostic test. You can do a timed 5-section exam under realistic conditions and see where you stand. And if your goal is not that and you want 5 points more or 10 points more, then there's more work to do. You can do more timed exams. You can review in depth. You can maybe change your approach. So if you've just been studying with free stuff or browsing forums and you need something more structured, or you need a course and you haven't done those things yet, you can consider doing those things. I think a lot of the courses are 2 to 3 months because that's what's economical to offer. You couldn't offer a 500-hour LSAT course, or the cost would be a lot higher, I presume. So there's a reality built in terms of what LSAT companies are able to offer and what students are reasonably able to commit to. But sometimes it takes longer than you think it will. LSAT retaking is more common than ever, especially since law schools don't average multiple LSAT scores. There's always incentive to retake if you think you can do better. But 3 to 5 months is what I see most students typically needing in order to reach their fullest potential. And it's worth it. I mean, the LSAT trumps even the GPA. And so if retaking could get you a few more points, get you some more scholarship money, I've heard from admissions people that even just a single point more can make the difference between a yes and a no, or between getting another $5,000 or $10,000 a year. So the ROI on that is huge. It's worth putting in the time. I wouldn't treat this as an afterthought. I would take it as seriously as at least a 4-credit class in college. There's plenty of spreadsheets if you want to just analyze. You can input your results and see which question types you have particular trouble with. So analysis of that sort isn't too complicated, but I think there's also another level to it, which is maybe it's not about the question type, maybe it's about the method of reasoning in the stimulus. And so in that case, you might look to explanations, or you might just look to deepen your own review process. I think a lot of students, they'll jump from method to method. I mean, there's so many out there. There's probably 12 to 15 major prep companies out there. They all have different terminology. They're all describing it in a slightly different way. And you don't want to jump between all of them and become a jack of all trades, master of none sort of thing. Okay, sometimes it makes sense to focus on one and give it a try for a bit. Maybe it takes a couple of timed exams or a couple of weeks before something starts to click or stick with your practice methodology. I think most students don't do enough when it comes to reviewing in depth. It's too easy to look for that quick feedback. It's like a dopamine hit when you see your results, and people can't even wait till the end of the exam. They're checking section by section. I know you guys do it because I do it too, and that's fine. But it's more valuable to delay gratification a bit, wait till the end of the exam so you're more closely mirroring your actual experience. And then with your review process, review not only everything you get wrong, but everything you have difficulty with. Students always say to me, I always get down to 2 and I pick the wrong one. Does that happen to you? I mean, it happens, right? But the thing is that you're also getting it right sometimes, but you're not paying attention to those instances because you got it right. You just move on. But anything you have trouble with, it could have easily just have gone the other way next time. So what you want to do is save a file. I agree, setting them aside is really good. And returning to them again and again. You could do them 10, 15 times. You could, photocopy or reprint multiple copies of these questions to do them clean. But the review process is the value in doing a timed section or exam. It's not about just doing the questions and seeing your results. You're not looking to evaluate yourself. You're looking to improve your understanding. So you want to ask yourself, was it something in the stimulus, the question stem, or the answer choices? Let's say we're talking logical reasoning, right? So if it's the stimulus, you obviously have to evaluate that, evidence, conclusion, sub-conclusion, counter premises, whatever it may be. Question stem, big things that give students trouble like necessary versus sufficient assumptions, which we can get into later. But there's also the answer choices. And for the answer choices, I think that's the toughest part of all, because a lot of students will confidently choose the most tempting wrong answer, move on, and they don't have a good sense of where they actually stand. Turns out you confidently chose it wrong. I'm friends with a former writer of actual LSAT questions, and I was chatting with him recently, and he was talking all about the patterns in how they make wrong answer choices tempting. They're very clever, devious people. And so, for example, the right answer to the tempting wrong answer to a necessary assumption question will often be a sufficient assumption question, a sufficient assumption answer choice, because it sounds tempting, it's strong. People like it. But what you want to do is figure out what was tempting about a wrong answer choice that made me pick it, and what ultimately made it wrong. And what was discouraging about the right answer choice that pushed you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct. And you want to do it again and again and again so that you're spotting the patterns in your mistakes. It's like there's 1,000 tricks the test makers might use, and you're not falling for all 1,000 or else you'd be getting a 120, which presumably you're not. And even if you are, that's okay. You can start from there and work up. But maybe you're getting you're falling for 50 tricks out of 1,000 or 100 tricks out of 1,000, and that's fine. You just got to figure out the patterns in your mistakes. And some items don't come up that frequently. It's like maybe one trick comes up every 5 exams or every 10 exams. You got to do that many exams to spot the patterns. But I think that analysis is really where the gains come from. When are you all taking the LSAT? Who's taking March? June? July? July? Okay, September? Beyond September? Okay, so all of you may or will definitely take the digital LSAT. The July test date, half of test takers get the digital format, half get paper and pencil. LSAC chooses, and you don't get any advance notice. So I would strongly recommend all of you go on LSAC's website, familiar.lsac.org, and play around with the interface. If you can, do it on your phone, do it on a tablet. I'm recommending that you get a tablet if you don't already have one. I know it's an expense, but you want to prepare as realistically as you possibly can because it's something new. LSAC's using a Microsoft Surface Go tablet, but the Samsung Galaxy Tab is a bit more affordable and might serve your purposes adequately. But one thing you want to be aware of is that although it's on a tablet, you cannot write on the page. So you can highlight, you can underline, you can flag questions, you can cross off using their tools, but you can't draw freehand the way that you are right now. So if your strategy is reliant upon bracketing things or writing in the margins, that's not going to happen on the digital LSAT. You'll have scrap paper. You can write on the side, but the back and forth, it's not really the same thing, and you're not getting any more time than you already have, 35 minutes. So just be aware of that. One thing I was thinking about a lot in terms of what to talk about today is order of approach and pacing on the logical reasoning section, because games and reading comp, they're grouped. If you invest a bit in the game or you invest a bit in the passage, that pays off throughout the rest of that grouping of questions. But logical reasoning, they're bite-sized, and so they're independent from each other, which means that they should not carry across from one to the next. Like your understanding of 19 should not affect your understanding of 20. But unfortunately, it does sometimes if you're stressing out about 19 because things didn't click for you. If you were investing minute after minute in question 19 and you're not making headway, adrenaline starts to pump, your heart's racing a bit, and you start to worry about that throughout the rest of the exam. As you do questions 20 to 26, as you do future sections in the exam, you're still thinking about number 19. And so I want you to reframe your approach. You don't need to get every question right to get a great score. The people who get a 170, they're typically getting perfect, maybe -1 on games, -3 on each of the LRs, and -3 on reading comp. So you don't need LR perfection. I'm not saying you shouldn't try for it, but what I am saying is that you shouldn't feel too invested in any one logical reasoning question, especially because they're independent. What you can do is you can flag 3 to 5 questions in the section, the toughest ones, and come back to this later. I got a 175 and I still do that now. If I see a question, maybe it's a parallel or principal application that takes up half the page, I'll say, you know what, I don't want to deal with that right now, maybe later. If it's question 9, I might do it in the moment because the method of reasoning will probably be simple. But if it's 19, 20, 21, that's as tough as it gets. So given that everything's worth the same, why focus so much on that one question? Similar if it's science and you're more of a humanities pre-law person like I am, or maybe it's formal abstract language. You can get better at those, but in the moment, you don't need to focus on them. Maybe questions 23 to 25 are going to be a little bit easier, and you can always come back to those tough ones later. Logical reasoning has a general order of difficulty, but not a perfect order of difficulty. So skipping around, coming back later is totally fine. One of the cool things about the digital LSAT is that you will be able to flag questions, and you'll see at a glance everything you flagged to come back to later. When it comes to getting better at those tough questions involving abstract or formal language, they come up only every now and then. Most LR questions are more informal and real-world relatable, but if they start using terms like antecedent and consequent, you're in trouble a lot of the time. Even if you understand the method of reasoning or the flaw they're describing, you might not recognize it with LSAC's wording. They use confusing wording on purpose, right? So one thing you can do is set aside every question that uses abstract wording. This is typically flaw questions and role of the statement questions. And so if you set aside all of those and do them in a row, you'll train yourself to define those words and phrases for yourself, turning them from LSAC's language into your language. So if antecedent and consequent are actually just referring to necessary and sufficient conditions, wouldn't it be nice to know that and not try to define it on test day for the first time? You can do that now. There's nearly 100 released exams 86 of which are numbered. And even if you were only studying from 10 of those exams, that would be enough to define all the words and phrases you need. But it's worth taking the time to do that, not just glossing over it and saying, oh yeah, I get it now, and moving on. Or if you're using explanations, whether they're video or written, that's just one person's take on it. It's not the only way to solve a question, and you also don't want to be using those as a crutch. So they're great if you're totally clueless, you want to get someone else's take on it, but ultimately your own review process, actually looking up words online. You Google the word like define antecedent, and you can see what it means, but actually taking the time to do that is really valuable. I talked about review already, so I won't go into it again, but I will say that analyzing the wrong answer choices and the patterns in the tricks they use is extremely important. One other thing I can talk about is confusing necessary and sufficient assumption questions. I was saying earlier about how they'll often include a sufficient assumption as a very tempting wrong answer choice for a necessary assumption question. It's really important to distinguish between them. You can do questions by type, but sometimes they'll often lump all assumption questions together in the same category without distinguishing between necessary and sufficient, although they're asking for very different things. I view necessary assumption questions as being a very specific kind of must-be-true question. A lot of people will view them as strengtheners, providing new information, but they're not. Whatever is necessary to assume for the argument is already implicit in the stimulus itself. A person who believes in the stimulus is logically committed to believing all necessary underlying assumptions. So for example, if we had a stimulus saying something like God created the world, then it is necessary to assume that there is or was a God at some point. You can't have the given stimulus that God created the world if there never ever was a God. So a person who believes the stimulus, again, is logically committed to believing all necessary assumptions. That's why using the negation or denial test works so well. The correct answer choice, when negated, destroys the argument. You could actually test this out for yourself on a must-be-true question, and you'll see that the same holds. How do you tell the difference between necessary assumption and sufficient assumption? You tell based on the word or phrase in the question stem. They'll use words and phrases that are synonymous with necessity. Words like depends upon, requires, assumes. They all mean necessary. On the flip side, sufficient assumption questions are asking for very different things. They're asking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. So that's like if you wanted to guarantee that you were able to buy a $1 item, if you learned as new information that you had $100, well, 100 is certainly sufficient to buy a $1 item. It's not necessary. You could get by with 5 or 10 or 20, those would all be sufficient, but having $100 is sufficient. On the flip side, having the value of a penny is necessary to buy a $1 item, but it's not sufficient to buy a $1 item. So having the right perspective really matters. And you might ask, well, are there things that are both necessary and sufficient to assume for an argument? And the answer is yes. Having $1 is both necessary and sufficient to get the $1 item, but a stopped clock is right twice a day. So occasionally you could get lucky if you confuse one for the other. But the vast majority of the time, it really matters which way you're looking at the argument. And so doing questions by type can really help both to just distinguish the difference between these two question types and then making sure that your perspective is correct for viewing each of them. But I don't want you to focus too much on doing questions by type because it is also important to make sure that you're properly understanding the stimulus. A lot of times I'll hear from students who say, I don't really notice patterns in my wrong answers or what I'm getting wrong. And then we see that they're already scoring, let's say, in like the low 160s or the high 150s. At that point, you might have a decent foundation in each of the question types. And so you don't notice any particular pattern. Or you might say that you're getting lots of flawed necessary assumption questions wrong. And I'll say, well, that's because there's lots of them to get wrong, right? Those are some of the most common LSAT question types. So if you're getting them wrong, it could just be because there's a lot of them to get wrong. It's like a sampling bias. So instead, you might want to think about the method of reasoning in the stimulus and making sure that you properly understand it. So we could take a given stimulus and provide a wide variety of question stems to help us change how we look at it. So for example, let's say we have an argument that we should eat at this restaurant because it has a 5-star rating on Yelp. We could ask, what would strengthen that? What would weaken that? What needs to be true based upon that? If we said, we should eat at this restaurant, it has 5 stars on Yelp, what might strengthen that argument? If a friend was making that suggestion to you.
There's like a lot of reviews.
Excellent. Perfect. So if we learned that there were 1,000 Yelp reviews and a 5-star average rating, that would strengthen the idea that we should eat at this restaurant. On the flip side, to weaken it, we could say, well, there's only one review. Or we could say, the reviews are all from the restaurant owner's family and friends who maybe are biased a little bit. Or we could say altogether, we don't like the cuisine. We could say, if we frame it slightly differently, we conclude that we should not eat at that restaurant even though it has 5 stars on Yelp. What might resolve that confusing situation, like a resolve the paradox question, if we learn the reviews were not a reliable indicator, that could explain that outcome for that situation. So playing around with your perspective, I think, is really useful to better understand the argument in the stimulus if the question-based approach is not working for you. All right, so let's say you're starting from complete scratch, you know nothing at all, and you're considering the self-study route. I would suggest you get one of the books of 10 LSAT exams 52 through 61. That's starting with September 07 to like October 2011, I think. And so those are fairly recent, so they're relevant. They are the modern format. They have the comparative reading, but they're not so new that you might want to save them for full-length time practice later. So you still have, in that case, 62 to 86 to do as full-length exams if you want to. I'm not saying you have to do all that if your timeline's shorter. Maybe build your foundation instead with exams 62 through 71. The idea is that you want to have at least 10 timed exams for test day, but you also don't want to prep with ancient stuff that's a little bit different in feeling. A lot of people love to do a timed practice diagnostic test cold. I personally don't like that approach because I find it very discouraging. I said myself, I got 152s and wasn't in love with that idea, but it's normal to not score where you want to be at first because you haven't learned anything yet. The LSAT, I think, is like a foreign language. It's a totally different way of thinking. It's so formulaic and technical. The people who write it are philosophy PhDs, as you can see from their text. And so it's normal to not do well at first, but you can improve. My study plans are oriented around, did you have a question?
No, I'm just
Okay, sure. So faking me out. So if you have let's say you're starting from scratch, you have a 3-month timeline, whatever it is, I'd say build the foundation first. Get the fundamentals. There's some great prep books out there. You can search Amazon for textbook-like materials. But ultimately, you want to start building your foundation in each section, games, reasoning, reading comp. And then once you've built the foundation in a particular section, then you start introducing timing. I recommend untimed first to actually deepen your understanding and make sure that you have time to engage with the problems. And then once you've done that, then you can introduce timing a bit and work on your pacing. Like I talked about order of difficulty, order of approach in logical reasoning. The same could be true to some extent in the other sections, which I can get into if you like, but it's foundation, the basics, then pacing with individual timed sections, and finally with full-length timed exams. That's my overall arc that I use for all my study plans. And this comes back to why I think maybe the diagnostic is useful as a tool if you wanted to simply see, okay, well, I wasn't that good before, now I'm really good. Like, that's great. But I think overall, most people need to learn the same things, especially for logic games, where those will seem more foreign than anything else to most people, and chances are you'll do no worse than randomly guessing no better than randomly guessing the first time you do a game section. And so I think everyone has to learn the same symbolic language and diagramming style to some extent. And there are a variety of methods. You'll find what works for you, and that's where the outside resources come in, because you don't want to reinvent the wheel. I think most people who have a humanities background, the reading comp may come more naturally, although LSAT reading comp is very different from SAT reading comp, so your approach will have to be different. But I think to some extent, except for the 1.9% of geniuses or whatever it is, like everyone's got to learn the same fundamental curriculum. Nobody's been doing like resolve the paradox questions or parallel questions for their entire lives. This is new to everybody except for the reading comp. So I think overall, you're going to want to work through a set curriculum, follow some kind of study plan or course curriculum if you're going that route. But there is something to be said for going from A to Z rather than jumping around a lot. The GRE, I mean, part of why there could be a lot of applicants with it. It's just that it's widely used for both grad school and now business school. I have been asking some admissions people about this, and what I hear is typically that it could be a good way for STEM majors to get in, people with that background. But if that's not you, the LSAT is probably the best way to indicate that you are serious about law school and not doing it as like a passing thought. So I would just consider that, but it is correct that, yeah, once you have an LSAT score on record, it'll be on your LSAT record for 5 years. And so you want to think about how seriously you want to do that. If your GRE is like way above what you suspect the school's median is, then maybe you could be okay with GRE. But part of what causes all this ambiguity is that this is a new thing, and we don't know how U.S. News' rankings are going to consider GRE scores, and that's what a lot of law school admission officers care about because they want to raise the school's reputation. Their jobs rest on that. And so everything they're about is how do we drive ourselves up in the rankings. If you have an LSAT score that's way above the median, then they're really going to want you. They might throw scholarship money at you or something like that. But the GRE, it's kind of unknown. I mean, obviously the best answer is just do really well on the LSAT, but that's what it's all about, right? The best way to evaluate whether you're going to get a score you want on test day is to look at what's the average of the most recent 3 to 5 exams you've taken within the past month, let's say. That is a good indication of where you stand. People rarely jump up 5 to 10 points from that average. You can typically expect to score around that average, or maybe slightly less due to test day nerves, or maybe slightly more if test day adrenaline gives you a boost. But you also want to make sure that these scores, you got them when you were practicing under realistic test day conditions with 5 sections strictly timed. So no bathroom break where the clock is stopped, or no eating snacks that you wouldn't be allowed. And I'd also recommend having, if you have caffeine, Red Bull, coffee, whatever it is, practice with that if that's what you're going to have on test day. Having that, your heart pumping on test day all of a sudden is going to be a big shock. So try to mimic test day as realistically as possible, then you'll know where you stand.